Yes, power scaling is dumb, but it is also fun, at least in casual discussions between friends. Not so much when people threaten one another over whether Batman or Superman should win in a fight. Given those two prior statements, it's also surprising, perhaps, that power scaling is actually sort of important, at least internally within the world of a story, as it, like many things, falls under the umbrella of having consistent internal logic. But it's not all logic, and the topic is sort of complex. Power scaling and the difference between what people will see as a great hero versus that specter of all online discussions about media, the Mary Sue or Gary Stu, is also a matter of audience expectations, some of which you can help and some of which you can't. This and more is the subject of our discussion today, about what it means to hit that golden zone that allows your protagonists to feel powerful yet not so strong that the story loses its tension, nor in your concern about overdoing their power, making your protagonist so weak or incompetent that it feels like they should lose. This all starts naturally with part 1, audience expectations. Much about power scaling and how people are going to view it is going to be established almost immediately after a character is described. In The Lord of the Rings, we're introduced in great detail to the people of the Shire and the Hobbits. We are getting an introduction into Tolkien's world, sure, but we're also subconsciously being given a list of reasons that none of these hobbits should be striking us as typical fantasy hero types. They're small and round and childlike and not martially inclined whatsoever. They're even less assuming than your typical village farm boy who at least should be physical fit from all the manual labor. These hobbits are then immediately contrasted by Gandalf, the wise old wizard clearly powerful far beyond the people of the Shire he's come to see. When we later meet characters like Strider, later revealed to be Aragorn, true king of Gondor, we understand him almost immediately to be a grizzled survivalist type who's lived out in the wild for ages, fighting monsters and the like. Even just with these little bits of introduction you get with characters right away, we can understand what sort of things we should be expecting them to be capable of. In essence, by saying what someone is, you're not only doing part of all the other things that actually go into making a story, like introducing the character and their background and what their life was like before the main thrust of the story begins and so on, but you're also establishing what this kind of character should be able to do, but also maybe hinting towards what sort of things they probably shouldn't be able to do unless they're established for you thereafter. You don't first read Frodo and think him capable of a hundreds of miles long journey with only himself and one friend trudging through wastelands and mountains and a land of volcanoes while bearing the weight of the most corruptive object in the world on his shoulders. And yet, that's a struggle that is contingent on, in essence, his willpower, and that same quality in Sam, of course. Something that is easier for us to believe that he can have a lot of, even if we don't initially expect it or see it. It's a hidden sort of strength. Had he instead somehow become the Doomslayer and personally killed Sauron in an epic 1v1, slaying millions of orcs in the process, that would be a lot harder of a thing to sell. It feels more ridiculous from the outset, considering what we know about what he should be able to do, and a lot more work would have had to be done to make that actually feel reasonable within the story. But no matter how much you develop that, it still wouldn't have worked, you might say. And you're right, and here's why. Because your character's power level is, as almost everything else, also an extension of your theme. Frodo being a badass warrior does not coincide with Tolkien's themes. A normal, unassuming person having the strength of will and friendship to overcome a strenuous journey thrust upon him by fate or necessity is much more of what he's going for, of course. In essence, if you write a grizzled war veteran, those immediately visible qualities are going to set expectations. That he's a good fighter being the most relevant to our discussion today. Then, if you write a regular high schooler and the closest thing they've gotten to combat training is a year of Taekwondo when they were 9, the expectation is that they aren't going to be a very skilled fighter. Not off rip, anyway. Troubles naturally then come if the teenager and the war veteran fight, and the teenager wins by sheer being the protagonistness. Everything to do with your character's power level when it comes to fighting is basically one big Chekhov's gun. With anything you do establish, there will be an expectation of it being used at some point. Anything you don't establish but is used anyway as a capability, like your teenager saying, "Oh yeah, I was kidnapped by a super secret spy order as a kid and they made me into a living weapon," after that fight with the grizzled war veteran is better than no explanation, slightly. but it's still pretty terrible. You might say, but J-Bat, I don't want my audience to know what all my character can do. Then it's boring. And that's actually fair. And that is the trickiest part in a way, mostly because it requires patience and care, and it's a lot easier to be impatient and careless. Because while it is easy to explain why random YA novel teenager protagonist 3000 shouldn't be soloing demigods, just because you happen to have someone who is established to be strong, like that grizzled war veteran dude, it doesn't mean he just gets to by default win every fight he's in either. Not understanding this is a big reason why like 90% of action movies are terrible, but the ones that do understand this tend to be a lot better. And in essence, that's because no fight should ever be won by your protagonist because they were simply better. Not for any super plot relevant fights, at least. John Wick can mow down regular mobsters because we've established that he's extremely proficient in the early moments of the movie, and the excellent choreography buys us a little more suspension of disbelief than might otherwise exist. And he is ultimately just better than the final boss of each of the movies that he's in, but he's never allowed to simply waltz in and kill any of them with no effort at all, because that'd be super boring. Even bad movies tend to understand that, at least, just not why else you can't do that. And all of this comes down to the ultimate piece of reasoning in this topic, and also why literally all power scaling, when taken seriously, especially when reaching across different pieces of media, is kind of moronic. The way fights are won and portrayed are not predominantly about who should realistically win the fight. Writing them so that they coincide with that logic will tend to make them better, but the winner isn't determined by who should win. It's about the story's theme and the protagonist's growth and things far more intangible than how many weapons they can fire at once. It's a reason that even John McClane from Die Hard, who is literally just a normal guy, could beat Goku in a fight under the right circumstances. And that's because characters don't fight outside of context. When people talk about power scaling, they're basically only talking about characters fighting outside the context of a story. But characters don't do that. They all exist within the context of stories that are trying to say something. Fights are an expression of what the story is trying to say, not of how powerful a character is. And that expression of what the story is trying to say can be something like a literal fight to the death, but in other stories it can be a court case or a debate or any other such thing. It is about the conflict, not about who's stronger in it. Stories are intrinsically about conflict. And so the primary thing that stories are about can never be resolved well by just saying, well, my character's a better sword fighter, so he wins. Well, my character is better at the conflict of story, so he wins. To emphasize this point before I crash out, I want to talk a little bit about Red Dead Redemption 2. Full game spoilers ahead, of course. In that game, which is a prequel to the first, you play as a man named Arthur Morgan, the right hand to Dutch van der Linde in a gang circa 1899. You spend most of the game following Dutch's directives, and Arthur trusts, for a while, that Dutch has their best interests in mind. However, after many disasters and many deaths among the gang, it becomes clear that things aren't going to last. The world isn't built to handle outlaw gangs anymore. It takes Arthur a tuberculosis diagnosis to finally get the shift in perspective he needed to understand what's happening. Knowing that he won't survive much longer, he realizes he needs to do right by those who will outlive him. And so in what I, and apparently also Arthur Morgan's voice actor, and a lot of other people consider to be the truest ending to the game, he tries to help John Marston, the first game's protagonist, escape the gang with his wife and son. As Arthur and John are chased into the mountains by Pinkerton agents who've been hounding you throughout the game, Arthur, struggling to keep up, promises John to hold them off. John doesn't want to let Arthur go, but he sees the writing on the wall. And so you're given one last confrontation with a character named Micah, the rat bastard who kept the Pinkertons on your trail this whole time and caused the deaths of many of the other gang members throughout the story. It devolves into a brutal fistfight, and this is where it really becomes relevant to our discussion. There's no real questioning that, outside of context, Arthur should win this fight easily, the same way Goku should beat John McClane, and by almost as big of a margin. Arthur Morgan is probably one of the finest gunslingers to have ever lived in his world, and Micah is good enough to have kept himself alive, but when he was a double agent for most of the people trying to kill you throughout the game, that probably isn't all that hard. But the thing is, because of the story, Arthur can't win this fight. In world, it's justified because of his tuberculosis. He was on the verge of death when he woke up that morning, much less after several gunfights and trying to run up a mountain that same day, which can't be easy when you're coughing up blood. But the reason he can't just off Micah isn't fundamentally about the tuberculosis. It's not about the power. What happens is that with the two beat up and a pistol knocked aside, Arthur crawls up to that pistol, even beating Micah to it, when Dutch stops him. Dutch, who is as much as Micah, though maybe less intentionally, responsible for all of these terrible things happening. Even Arthur getting TB is because of the gang's misadventures and Dutch allowing another character to exploit people. But Dutch doesn't let Arthur get the kill. But if you playing the game acted with generosity and selflessness and your Arthur has high honor, Micah doesn't get to kill him in return either. Instead, Dutch leaves and Micah slinks off, and thus Arthur is left to his inevitable death while at least getting to see one last sunrise. So why is it that that was the best way to do it? Why do you only get to kill Micah later as John at what's called the epilogue to the game, and not even the actual ending? Because Red Dead Redemption is about, believe it or not, redemption, not revenge. Arthur getting the kill on Micah would not fit the theme. He didn't change, didn't save John, didn't try to do right in his last days, just so he could out the rat and kill him. It wasn't about Micah. It was so he could do what little he was capable of to redeem himself when that was all that was left for him to do. And out of the 4 endings in the game, that's what makes that particular one to me by far the most thematic. It allows Arthur his full character arc, and it isn't diluted by revenge, which in a game so full of examples as to why revenge and a continuing cycle of violence are part of the problem and not a solution to anything, would have really reduced how impactful the ending was. And yet that fight's conclusion making sense through Arthur being weakened by his sickness is still important, as it is still a part of bending our expectations such that the eventual outcome doesn't feel unjustified, which itself could have just as easily defeated the thematic impact. It's about the balance between theme and reality. Keeping the audience's expectations in mind is important, but expectations can, to an extent, be modified by a willing audience. Some people just won't want to read certain kinds of characters or stories even if you execute them well, or it might be difficult to convince an audience that a concept will be well executed because it's done wrong so often. The most infamous one being that there's nothing actually intrinsically wrong, of course, with young female YA protagonists, but some people might be averse to the concept because in a lot of other media they have a reputation for being kind of poorly written. In the exact same vein, people might not want to read a grizzled 30-something war veteran type character because it's an archetype that is also kind of known for being very samey. And yet all of those can be overcome. Ultimately, don't concern yourself with what you have no control over and do your best with what you can. And a lot of that comes from the crux of my argument, which I've already slightly mentioned, part 2, the perfect balance. If you're concerned about finding the proper balance of power to give a character, no matter how nebulous power can be, you aren't so much looking to balance them with other characters. Making your character stronger than Goku doesn't make them more interesting, and making them weaker than John McClane doesn't make them uninteresting. Instead, power scaling is about finding the balance between achieving the expression of your theme and being believable. There's a lot of discussion, especially in the places in the internet I linger, to do with writing medieval fantasy, my genre of choice, with making things realistic. For a variety of reasons, I think it's sort of the wrong angle to be thinking about fantasy with, but what applies there applies to everything. Realism is not as important as believability, nor is it as important as you correctly expressing the theme you're aiming for. While people obsessing over how medieval media is unwatchable if there's ever a single moment where a sword cuts through metal armor is kind of silly, there is, buried in that concern, the actually important part that your reliability as a storyteller is contingent on the things you say making sense. The audience obviously knows the story you're telling is fiction, but the more you do to remind the audience that the thing they're consuming not only didn't happen, but couldn't happen on the basis of logic alone, the harder time you're going to have getting them to take your work any kind of seriously. And as an example, we're doing a crazy callback all the way back to the very first video video on this channel where I talked about The Secret History by Donna Tartt in those dark days when I was even worse at making thumbnails. The Secret History by Donna Tartt is like 95% an amazing book. It concerns an outsider entering into the secret world in a limited class of a few people, taught by an enigmatic teacher of ancient literature and language. Even as someone who's never really had a particular interest in antiquity, my own historical obsessions start more in the 700 to 1700 range, the way in which they discuss ancient media and how the characters seem to live in this world surrounding the fictional Hampton College of Vermont is great. Each of them is super interesting. But the twist, however, is that it is an inverted detective story. After a bacchanalia inspired by their teachings leads to the murder of a farmer, the class also murders one of their classmates who seemed like he'd spill about the prior killing, and everything beyond that point goes ridiculously wrong as they try to conceal their crimes. Henry, the effective leader of the class, especially as the professor distances himself from the situation, takes charge. Though you're missing much context and you really should just kind of read it for yourself. It really is very good except for the part I'm about to tell you. He ends up killing himself with a pistol. It perfectly fits as the climax to the novel and the way that he does it. And yet all the impact it could have had was ruined for me by the fact he manages to shoot himself in the head twice. I could get into the mechanics of it and why, as it's portrayed, it makes even less sense than it sounds like it does. But if you can stomach my old content, just watch that first video. But in essence, it's just not really a thing that's going to happen. And that was a moment where believability and theme did not mesh and it broke the story. And it's a shame because it was so unnecessary of an extra detail. Had he just shot once and the exact same thing happened, it would have worked fine. But for some reason, it needed to be two. Now, you could reasonably ask why I'm power scaling Henry's skull against a pistol round, but the point is that thinking in terms of power scaling is just the wrong way to go about writing a story in general. As much as I understand why people ask it, and it's why this video is what it is and called what it is and so on and so forth. But all power scaling is really about is understanding the mechanics of the powers that you're working with. Donna Tartt, for the multitude of things she does understand, clearly didn't understand firearms very well. We even see that in other assorted moments throughout the book too where firearms are present, though those examples are far less egregious generally. All this being the case, this is why power scaling is the type of questions you might see thought or asked about a lot more when it comes to speculative fiction, your sci-fis and your space operas and your fantasies and so forth. In those, we're working with the mechanics of things we cannot understand in a literal, real sense. We cannot say for 100% certain that an energy sword from Halo could withstand a lightsaber because those two weapons are operating in different universes with different rules. And talking about their temperatures and their specific materials and whatever as if they're real things is a complete waste of time. Because the actually important difference is that they are not operating on the same rule set. It's just hard for people to accept that comparing those sorts of things is the most literal apples and oranges type of comparison you can do, and it'll never yield particularly convincing results. It's one of the reasons that people have this stupid argument about how in fact Kirby is one of the most powerful characters in fiction. One could argue that power scaling stupidity is worse in the case of something like The Secret History because the issue there was so preventable. You can get reliable information on how guns work for the purposes of your writing. It's not really all that hard, so doing that wrong is maybe worse, but it can feel worse when working with magic or tech so advanced it might as well be magic, because if the outcome of something feels determinate on that magic or technology being able to do something the audience could have never expected it to be able to do, then not only is the audience going to be blindsided, but they'll know they never could have known what was going to happen because there was no basis for them to go off. And so when you're working with the sorts of things the audience cannot be expected to understand intrinsically, you need to help them understand these powers as the story goes on. If you can't write how your hero wins the final battle without him pulling a new power out of his hat, then you need to either rewrite the power or rewrite the final battle, not go ahead with the hat pulling anyway. Let the audiences see how the power scales up to other things in the universe before it becomes super relevant to the plot, and consider how these powers should affect the world they're in, as bad power scaling destroying your world's logic is almost as bad as it destroying your plot's logic, which is why I want to cover it a little bit at the end here. Benders from Avatar, for example, are very powerful, and well well designed because they are in tune with the world they live as a part of. You can see how their powers affect the world and the society around them because the writers created the powers, their culture, and society, all with the intent of them working together to create a coherent visual theme and a logic for the way the world works. But if there were, for example, nuke benders, and notwithstanding all the thematic ways in which that wouldn't make any sense, that wouldn't make sense to exist as a concept simply because the first nuke bender would have destroyed a civilization. It's for that reason that when it comes to doing these things for the concern of your world as opposed to your plot, you need to be careful, and increasingly and exponentially more careful when building more and more powerful characters, because while they might get stronger, it doesn't mean the world gets any more durable. If a guy's so strong that he could pick up and throw a train without much effort, does he have to make special efforts not to break doorknobs or shatter glasses when he goes to take a drink? The world of cardboard effect should always be in the back of your mind if you're making really powerful characters. Anyway, I just wanted to cover that a little bit on its own. I could make a whole video about that specific effect alone. But in summary, power scaling is dumb. Yes, obviously, it's the first thing I said. But there are a lot of tertiary surrounding concerns that are worth your time. But the fact is that theme and general logic are a lot more important. Anyway, I hope you had fun listening to me ramble all the same. If this sounds like a place you want to be, we have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos early. As we close out, I'd like to thank those patrons of mine: Shadowrunner, Sonny, Isaac Parrott, Raymond, Don Sadako, Cavalier, and Sazabi of the Knights of the Inner Circle. Vion and Jodion Void are knights, and Greer, TOW, Craig, Victoria Lauren, and Noah are loyal squires. And remember, no matter how powerful your protagonist is, you probably couldn't beat Uncle Grandpa in a fight.